We're standing in front of the Tenement Museum on New York City's Lower East Side. This area was home to generations of immigrants beginning in the middle of the 19th century. First the Irish, and then the Germans, and then Jews and Italians, and finally Hispanics and Chinese. This building that we're standing in front of is going to be introduced to us by Polland, who's the educational director of the Tenement Museum complex. Annie, tell us what we're going to see in this building.
Sure. Good morning and welcome to the museum. So this building was built in 1863, and between 1863 and 1935, when it was open to residents, more than 7,000 people lived here. All of them immigrants or the children of immigrants, and as you mentioned, coming from different parts of Europe. And over time, one of the things that bound all of these residents of 97 Orchard Street together were their ties to the garment industry. And in 1900, 6 out of 10 people working and living in this building worked in the garment industry. So we're going to see 2 of those families, and we're going to look at how the families made their livings and in some ways stitched together new lives.
Great. Let's take a look inside.
Excellent. So here we are in the hallway of 97 Orchard Street, and this hallway has seen a lot of action. In this space, you'd have the residents entering and exiting. What you would also have is that you'd have people in and out towards the back on their way to get water. Until 1905, there was no running water in the building, and there were also no bathrooms in the building. So all of that was located in the rear yard. So what you have then is people from early in the morning coming down with buckets of water to get the water to bring back upstairs to their household. What you would also have is people coming in to work. In 97 Orchard, we know that some of the apartments doubled as sweatshops, as garment shops that people worked in. And you also have people leaving 97 Orchard on their way to school or on their way to their shops in other places or on their way to their push carts. So a tremendous amount of activity of people entering and exiting. No one would have stood still in this space. You might also have visitors to the tenement, reformers, who we now call part of the progressive era. People like Lillian Wald, a settlement house worker who might be coming in to check on the health of some of the residents in the building. You might have someone like Jacob Reese, a photographer, coming to take pictures to document the conditions of people living in the tenements. You might have journalists. Sometimes you had reformers who were gathering evidence and information to make a case for better laws. And as a result of that work, 1901 housing law was passed mandating light, mandating bathrooms, mandating running water, and creating an inspection bureau of tenement inspectors who would come visit tenements like this to ensure that the landlords had made the necessary changes. A lot of the landlords were against this law and fought it, which is why it took from 1901 to 1905 to have these changes made. But once the changes were in place, it affects the lives of the residents greatly because they now have indoor bathrooms, 2 toilets per floor. They now have running water in their homes, and they now have gas light. So it's a dramatic change. And all of it came from the work of these reformers. So here we are in Harris and Jenny Levine's shop. This is where Harris and Jenny Levine moved in 1892. They've been in New York for maybe 2 years. They're both immigrants from Polland, Poland. We know from their descendants that they got married in Polland and basically spent their honeymoon on the ship in steerage on their way to America and to a new life. And their new life was governed by the garment industry and was shaped by the forces on the Lower East Side. So when Harris first arrived, most likely he worked for someone else, but for 2 years, Harris and Jenny saved money so that they could have their own shop. And to open up your own shop didn't require a whole lot. You needed a space, you needed a sewing machine, you needed an ironing board, and then you needed a few workers to help you do your work. Harris was a contractor who would get work from a manufacturer, most likely a schlepper. A young boy would be bringing over a bundle of work to do, and Harris would then be responsible for transforming pieces of fabric into a dress, into a shirtwaist, into whatever the contract called for. To get this done, he needed to hire people. So he's going to hire a young girl to be a baster who would sew the garments by hand. Harris himself would operate the sewing machine, which was foot powered, so he'd be sitting here by the window to get as much light as possible, and he'd be running the sewing machine. Then you'd have another young girl, maybe 14, 15, 16 years old, the finisher, and she would take the fabric and she would sew the sleeves on, she'd sew the lace on, she'd sew details. Finally, the garment would go to the presser who would iron it, and the presser was located right next to the stove. He needed to be next to the stove in order to get the coals for his iron. So this would repeat 14 hours a day. I think another thing to think about when we stand in these spaces is to try to imagine the anxiety that would have pulsed through a room like this as people rushed to get clothes done. We try to imagine, too, Friday afternoon, Jenny Levine standing at the doorway. She can't wait for the workers to go home because then she can reclaim the space as her own and get ready for the Jewish Sabbath, which was something that they had brought over from the old country and were trying to adapt to the tenement. In the kitchen, where Jenny did her work, you can see signs of the children who were here. Jenny and Harris had 5 children. Pauline was born in 1892, the same year that they opened their shop. They would also have Hyman and Max, Eva and Faye. So 5 children growing up in this 325 square foot apartment that also doubled as a garment shop. Jenny's life was probably one of the most difficult to navigate physically because her base of operations is the stove. She needs the stove to heat the water to clean the diaper. She needs the stove to make the soup to feed the family. But yet, she has the presser standing right next to the stove, and she's going to have to kind of navigate and move around his work. So there's all sorts of reports from oral histories and memoirs about the missus and the presser not always getting along. And you can see on the mantle Jenny's Sabbath candlesticks, and again, those were hidden behind the pots and pans during the week, but on Friday afternoon, she's able to take those off as she sets up a dining room table or eating table in the front room. Once the work of the factory has been put away, this is a time where the family is able to come together and a time in which they're trying to kind of mark out as sacred the time of the Sabbath as they're raising their family. In the bedroom, you can see Jenny's brown dress hanging up on the door post. And one thing that's kind of interesting to think about or to consider is how did Jenny feel wearing that brown dress, a very simple fabric, when she looked at this beautiful pink dress that was being made in the factory? The dresses that were often made in these tenements and the shirtwaists were not necessarily going to be worn by people who lived in the tenement districts, but rather these goods were packaged off and sent to Macy's, or maybe they were sent across the country as part of the catalogs that were growing. And so by 1910, I think about 70% of all women's clothing is coming from New York. So it's coming from places like this. But the work of these tenements and the work of these immigrants is in many ways clothing the nation. So we can't really understand the lives of middle-class people at the time, and we certainly can't understand the clothes they're wearing without thinking about these small, humble spaces. What starts to happen around 1900 is that sewing machines are made that require electricity. And as we know, the tenements don't provide electricity. And so it's at this point that you have a kind of minor revolution in the creation and in the production of garments as the clothes move out of the tenement shops and into larger factories located uptown, in which a manufacturer will now, instead of bundling the clothes and sending them off to hundreds of contractors, instead the manufacturer will hire millions of workers to come in, often teenage girls, to come into the factory shop and produce the clothes. By 1905, the Levine family moves out of 97 Orchard Street. They're able to take the Williamsburg Bridge and move to Williamsburg, where they continue working in the garment industry. This time, though, perhaps Harris has his own shop and the home is separate. But just as the Levines are moving out, there are more immigrants moving in, and you have this constant cycle of immigrants leaving the Lower East Side but being replenished, being replaced by new workers. Around 1901, the Rogoszewski family arrives from Telch, Lithuania. They live on Orchard Street, and around 1907 move into 97 Orchard Street. We've recreated their apartment to be around 1910, 1911, so that we can take a look at how the garment industry has changed and how families are now navigating the garment industry in slightly different ways. So Abraham and Fanny Rogoszewski move into this apartment around 1907. They have 6 children: Bessie, Ida, Morris, Sam, Henry, and Philip. 3 of their children are going to go out to work to help support the family. 3 of their children will go to school. And you can see how their apartment is set up. We're able to understand how they lived here. The parents shared the bedroom. Bessie and Ida, the teenage girls, shared this cot that's set up in the kitchen. And the 4 boys slept on this couch in the parlor. We surmise by putting their heads on the cushions of the couch and then using chairs and using crates to kind of prop up their legs and their feet. Abraham Rogoszewski worked in a shop much like Harris Levines, but the garment industry had started to shift uptown to bigger factories. Abraham, it appears, did not want to work at one of those factories because many of those factories were open on Saturday, and he refused to work on the Sabbath. And so we don't know exactly what happens in this family, but we know, according to the 1900 census, that Abraham's been out of work for 13 weeks. So a lot of the burden of making money for this family is going to fall on the shoulders of the teenage children. And we know from the Yiddish newspapers, we know from memoir literature, that often teenage children who went to work in the garment industry, some of them were working on Saturday. So who knows what this conversation would have been like, but we try to imagine a conversation between Bessie or Ida coming home and telling Fanny, look, I found a job, it's a great job, it's going to pay $10 a week, I'm going to be in a factory with girls my age who I can gossip with and talk to, but I'm going to have to work on Saturday. If this happened, right, would Fanny have been upset about this, or would Fanny have also understood that they needed that money no matter what it meant? What we do know is that it was very common in a lot of these families for some members to work on the Sabbath, but others to adhere to the Sabbath as scrupulously as they did before. And so we've set up the Sabbath table to show Fanny maybe setting up the table. It's kind of halfway set. We have this prayer book here, which is a woman's prayer book, and many of the prayers in the prayer book actually were prayers written in Yiddish for the Sabbath candle blessings that came from Europe. But in this volume was one added for America that the prayer says, you know, God, help me support my family, help protect my family so that they do not have to work on the Sabbath. So we see how much this fear of Sabbath work has become part of even the prayers these women are saying. At any rate, what's also happening in the shops is a lot of union organizing. So Bessie and Ida, working in the shops, might have heard about people organizing the growth of unions, the fight for better hours, the fight for better working conditions, the fight for a kind of more humane existence as a worker. And they might have gone to meetings. Maybe Bessie and Ida heard Clara Lemlich gave a speech in 1909 exhorting the workers to go on strike to fight for better conditions. And these were the years that the union was growing. What happens in 1911, as you can see from this Yiddish newspaper, the Jewish Daily Forwards, is from March 26, 1911. It's the day after the Great Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, in which 146 workers were killed as a fire spread through the 3 floors of a factory located near Washington Square. This, along with union activity, kind of spurs New York residents to fight for change and to clamor for change, and it's in the wake of this fire that a factory investigation commission is created to investigate factory work and to start to fight for more laws to protect the workers. And this is an incredible moment. Now, the Rogoszewski daughters did not die in this fire, thankfully. They did not, as far as we know, work in the Triangle factory, but they probably worked in a factory just like it. Bessie and Ida, of course, come home that day, but then the family has to think about the fact that they're all going to go back on Monday to a factory like that and still endure these conditions. So even though this home looks a lot bigger, it's the same square footage as the Levine apartment we saw before. But even though the factory isn't set up in this space, there's no question that the stresses of the factory are impacting the home life of the Rogoszewski family.